All right, welcome to our first panel discussion of the day. This is titled Tapping into the $400 billion Market Opportunity Offered by Anything as a Service. I'd like to introduce our panel, Azita Arvania with Rakuten, who just presented, and Mr. David Joosten, Regional Director, Vodafone Americas. From Deloitte's Technology, Media, and Telecommunications Practices, Arpan, Tiwari, and then from VoltDB, Mr. David Rolfe. So thank you all for joining us today for the discussion. Azita, you referenced this bit of research from Bain Company in your presentation, but just to summarize for the audience, the premise here is that telcos need to deliver business outcomes as a service rather than selling connectivity as a commodity. So maybe we could start with a framing question here and get some thoughts from everybody on the panel. First, what do you think of that premise around selling business outcomes? And then, are operators at risk here of not capturing that market opportunity if they don't take a strategic approach to how they partner and engage with other stakeholders? David, maybe we can start with your perspective from Vodafone.
Oh, well, business outcomes, I think for the last couple of years, that has been our main focus is getting our sales teams and our offerings to sell business outcomes. Customers are not necessarily looking for products. They're not necessarily waiting for every product that every operator has to offer. They're trying to solve a problem, and they don't want to be experts in technology or telecommunications. So I think in every offering that we put out to market or how we position ourselves, it needs to be oriented around the business outcome. So that's very clear for us. I don't know. The second question was around where do we see the monetization of all of that, and then how 5G, for example, is monetizing things for us as a business. I think there is still a way to go in terms of that. Especially in creating new solutions and all that, or partners creating those new things. I think where we see the biggest impact on specifically in the specific industries are healthcare, manufacturing, logistics. I think that's where we see most monetization happening at this point. A lot of it around, and I've mentioned that I think also in last session we had, it's around mobile private networks, is where customers are really looking at redefining how they connect things on the network, on the amounts of data that they are sending through. And I think that's where we see most take up at the moment in the industry. There is also, I would say, a really big need for ecosystem. What we do advocate and evangelize a lot is that, well, we can do everything as a telco ourselves. We've done that in the past. I think we were not very successful with that. So we do need ecosystem. I do think we need to create open platforms. We do rely a lot at the moment on developers and new technology integrators to bring certain new applications to the market. And as a telco, we will, of course, do some things ourselves, but we will be very specific in what, because we cannot create new solutions for every kind of industry. So that's a bit, I would say, our take on that.
Arpan, maybe you could weigh in here. Deloitte has an interesting perspective in that you're working with the enterprise buyer and the operator or technology company that's selling into that vertical. But what are your thoughts on how to best address this opportunity?
Absolutely. I mean, in this day and age, we all live in basically a consumption-driven economy, right? So everything today is basically offered as a service, and even enterprises expect pretty much the same. So if you are offering something as a service, the consumption or the outcome is paramount, because if there is no success that the enterprise is getting, there is going to be no consumption. So it's imperative that you basically start getting into that mode of delivering outcomes, delivering solutions, so that the consumption of the services that you're offering is there. So it's basically paramount and central to it. And I've seen this shift in thinking vis-a-vis the operators. So now they are much more looking at essentially going after targeted industry verticals, talking the same language as to how do we land a solution, how do we solve a particular business problem. And tied to it is also the question of how do you gain that specific industry vertical specialized knowledge because gone are the days where you're selling plain vanilla network services. Now you have to deliver outcomes or solutions. And to be able to do that, you have to understand what is the fundamental issue that the enterprise is looking to solve. So there is that specific industry domain knowledge that they are looking to acquire through targeted hirings, through selective partnerships with SIs, through working with consulting firms who have that body of knowledge to be able to succeed in industry verticals. So that's one. David also referred to the point of like creating new solutions, platforms. So that's another thing that we are starting to notice is a lot of telcos are investing in essentially creating their own edge computing platforms, investing in network as a service offerings, and so on. So they're looking at essentially moving up the stack, more towards the platform layer, and to some degree even trying to get into the application domain, which is still a little bit away. But that movement up the stack is happening. And then it comes down to, I mean, to be able to succeed, you have to move away from selling connectivity-based bare products into services and solutions and outcomes. And tied to this is also a question of how do you train your workforce to be able to succeed and deliver in that model? Because that's a different way of going about it as opposed to the way, telcos have operated up until now. They've been successful at it, but given the changes that we're looking at, how do you change that mindset? How do you change that culture where you are more focused on outcomes and essentially making yourself part of a solution, going to business with a whole host of ecosystem players? So it's a little bit of a culture and a workforce shift to it as well.
David, what's your perspective from VoltDB with your specialization in data platforms? When we think of an operator partnering to engage an enterprise, what sort of models are you involved in?
We're seeing in some of the models we're involved in. We're looking at this because we operate in the very short millisecond range. We are looking at the whole 5G space from the perspective of, if the value prop of 5G and edge is based on, we can do things really, really quickly, you need solutions which can operate at that speed and operate at scale. And this is, I think, a trap people are going to fall into quite soon, is you cannot add low latency when you're finished, any more than you make something geo-distributed after you've written it. This has to be done early. And I think that we're going to see a bunch of people enter the space. They're going to take all the trendy stuff and build these big complicated stacks. And then, as von Clausewitz, the German military theorist, he has this concept of friction, which is where everything you've got is perfect. Everything moves really well individually, but when you try and you do it all at once, live in the field, it all goes to hell. And so what we're going to see, I suspect, is early failures in the field as people build wonderful things and deploy them, and they don't come up to scratch. And that's where I think that people need to really think this through carefully, and they really need to, in the same way that IKEA start with the price and go backwards, people need to start with the latency budget and go backwards when they build these solutions, and not build something and worry about latency afterwards. Because it doesn't matter how many people you are, doesn't matter how clever you are now fighting the speed of light. So unless you're really Christopher Nolan movie clever, you are not going to beat it.
And Azita, I wanted to circle back your previous session, disruption as a service. It's clear that Rakuten Symphony is all in on this as a service consumption model. In this panel, to degrees, we're focused on an enterprise buyer, but in the case of Rakuten Symphony, you're selling to telco companies. But so maybe just tell us a little bit about why you see that consumption model as a service, RAN as a service, core as a service, whatever it might be, as desirable to an operator. What does that do for them? You're on mute, Azita.
Yeah. So if you think about how the operators are challenged today with the big cost of CapEx that they have to put in every time you have a new G coming in, right? So they have to these massive CapEx numbers, and then OpEx, and then they wait for the ARPUs or business ARPUs or consumer ARPUs to pick up on and pay back the investment. So we think that, starting in 4G, but especially going into 5G, that model cannot be successful, right? Like, you may have some tier ones that just being able to do that, but you cannot have like regional operators being able to compete at that level. You cannot have private cellular networks to take to provide value for the industries and so forth. So that model has to change. And also we've been looking at 5G with this the massive throughput, very low latency, mission critical, life critical type applications, and also the massive IoTs that we're talking about. Those kinds of things really require a platform that is very flexible, very agile, and also I like what David Rolfe said. It has to really be designed with latency in mind from the beginning, right? So and offering these things as a service to operator allows them to play around with this thing and see what works for them, and going with much lower investment. I mean, you can see that operators trying to do the cost efficiency by RAN sharing and all kinds of other things, to be able to lower the cost. But we think that in addition to lowering the cost, which this as a service could provide them a lot of value, but they can also bring in new services running on top to generate new revenue, right? So instead of giving that over-the-top type of model only to others to come in, they can actually take advantage of it themselves. I also wanted to mention that it's really important that you keep thinking about that platform as a continuously evolving and improving thing. If you're an operator, you've already invested a big CapEx, OpEx into your network, you may not be inclined to bring in the latest technology on there because it'll cost you a lot more. As a service model provides that opportunity that your, in this case, Rakuten Symphony continually brings it up to date, so you don't have to worry about keeping it at the top of the technology level. So I think lowering the friction with enhancements, bringing new innovation in, being able to try new innovations from different vendors, since you have an open model, is really critical.
And David, you mentioned some of the verticals where Vodafone was seeing traction. I think you called out logistics, healthcare, manufacturing, but maybe you could just sort of walk us through a hypothetical project where you have kind of clear line of sight on moving from pilot to scale to something that you would deem profitable or effectively monetizing Vodafone's investment.
I think if you look at, for example, an automotive customer that we support at the moment, we started off with first implementing an MPN or mobile private network in a plant in the UK, which was basically two installations. One just for for welding, so welding that got connected to the network, or welding machines that got connected to the network, and then the other one was actually a mirroring of that network to a university for welding. So they actually implemented two MPNs for that solution. And that was the first one. That was a POC. I think was even funded by the government in the UK at the time to see how new innovation could enhance digital solutions. Actually, the first one. And that one actually led to discussions on adding much more sensors and much more machinery to that installation. And going from that one, we went to looking at it from a much more global scale, to doing that in every plant that they had on a global scale. So with that in mind, even though we only offer a part of that solution, I think it grew quite significantly as it became clear that the applications for that were actually numerous. I think if you also look at artificial intelligence and all those kinds of things, IoT, sensoring, if you can put all those things together, it's actually a massive revolution for certain customers. So as they started trying out with those two POCs, it became a much larger project, and we're seeing that pretty much in all manufacturing industries. And same thing for hospitals, for example. I think there they start off with small deployments, which leads them to much larger deployments in the future.
And Azita, we've heard the word ecosystem used a few times already, and I expect it's going to come up a lot more throughout the program today. But if we look at Rakuten Mobile and the work you did in terms of getting vendors to collaborate, open up their interfaces so that you could deploy a true Open RAN network there in Japan, could you talk to us a little bit about what goes into fostering those ecosystems and the governance models that need to be put into place? And then once you've done that, how do you hide all that complexity from the end user?
Yeah, so great question. First, you need to pick your partners very carefully, and then really again comes back to mindset. People need to be committed that you're in this together for providing this open architecture, right? So it wasn't easy, especially back in 2018, where we all know that we've been talking about this open architecture and virtualization and so forth for a long time, but it's really stayed in the POC and trial level, right? So bringing people together and saying, now we're going to do this at scale. So we are committing to these partners, and so we had one partner per domain that we had picked, and then we really worked very hard with them to get over these issues that would come up. And there are a lot of issues that do come up. So by really working through all the painful process of getting it all together, but the commitment was there from us and from all the partners, and the fact that if your technology does not add up, that doesn't stay at the high level, then you're out, and there's nothing personal. Then we look at something else. If you look at the way we did the 4G network, not every partner made it to the 5G set of partners. So this commitment, like really exacting commitment to not giving in, like always trying to get the best innovation for the component that you're having. You're either partnering with someone, you're either buying it, or you're developing it. That has to be the model. That's why that disruption as a service is really what we think about all the time.
And Arpan, maybe you could flip this for us and talk us through that buyer perspective. So if I'm an enterprise decision maker, how are these people thinking about extracting value from 5G? Is it something that's kind of a point solution, or is it something that's part of a bigger, more holistic strategy where 5G serves as a kind of force multiplier?
Absolutely. And I've seen essentially both ends of the spectrum. So it depends on like who you talk to in the enterprise, what level are they at, and what's honestly their mandate and charter. So I've seen discussions that are much more targeted, much more specific, something on the lines of, hey, I would like to use certain high definition cameras in my retail store to prevent shrinkage, which is basically the industry term for merchandise getting lost or things of that nature. So there are those kinds of use cases. There are discussions around, hey, I have certain high value merchandise that I'm shipping from point A to point B, but somewhere in between, it's getting damaged. So what can we do through a connection or a combination of sensors and the 5G network? So nothing wrong with these, but these are on the point scale, basically something which is literally a very targeted or a very specific use case. Now, I've seen the other end of the spectrum, which is, hey, talk to me about future of retail. What does that look like? How do I transform the buyer experience? What does that retail store of the future look like? What does a hospital without walls look like? What is the future of manufacturing, Industry 4.0? So I've seen those discussions as well. And if you think from a buyer's perspective, they are trying to solve a particular problem statement. But if you talk to the C-levels, it's more on the lines of how do I set up my enterprise to be successful 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now on? And how can I use the power of this disruptive technology to enable that vision? And if you talk from an ROI perspective, the ROI would be much higher if you take something like a 5G and put it at the very center of an entire digital or a business transformation exercise. The ROI would simply be far higher than you go after individual use cases, because at some point you start getting economies of scale. Hey, I have a private network that's up and running. I have invested in the camera infrastructure. Now it's a question of stacking use cases, almost like Lego blocks, where you're building towards something which is much higher value, much bigger than what you would basically get with a singular use case. So it's a broad spectrum, but I would always encourage in any discussion, let's just put the bigger picture in mind, because that's where you'll get the ROI. And once you know what your North Star is, then let's basically take baby steps towards that North Star, as opposed to going in all sorts of directions, choosing point use cases.
David, you mentioned that where Volt plays, milliseconds really matter. And when I think of the big picture of enterprise digitization, I'm thinking of machine-to-machine type communications and automated decision-making that really hinges on data quality. And as you pointed out, milliseconds do matter. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what does that mean for how operators need to design and deliver 5G-enabled solutions?
The thing I'd say, having unmuted myself, thus destroying all technical credibility instantly, is that you need to look at history. When they brought in barcoding for groceries, all of a sudden the supermarkets had suddenly woke up one morning with data warehouses of what was being sold, where and when. And suddenly Tesco and Britain would know exactly how many cans of baked beans were sold in Scotland on a Tuesday afternoon. And they had no idea what to do with the information. So we're seeing a rush to say, oh, I'm going to build stuff, I'm going to use 5G, I'm going to manage it remotely, they're going to have this vast amount of data flying back and forth. And I'm not necessarily seeing the same level of thought going to what do people do once they get this information? Are they going to monetize it? Are they going to be careful? If you do nothing with it, it is a liability. I live in Europe, we have GDPR. If you're holding other people's data for no good reason, you're heading for trouble. But so, for example, possible scenarios would be they could do a Zendesk on it, where Zendesk is a help desk software, which they make money by allowing you to compare your organization's behavior effectiveness and ability to resolve tickets and compare it to others, which gives you the command and control information which you didn't have as a manager before. So maybe you might find that you offer solutions to people for 5G automation, various things, and the value add you deliver is you allow them to compare their organization's performance with other people. So I just think that there needs to be more thought around the business models, and it needs to be fully fleshed out rather than just frantically automating stuff for the sake of automating stuff. And also, once you get into the serviceization, that's a long word, and start doing stuff as a service, you are in a different business. Now, for example, I have a domestic Wi-Fi router. I have to replace it every 2 to 3 years because the manufacturer stops providing patches, and I'm not willing to run unpatched hardware. If they're providing Wi-Fi as a service, then all of a sudden the kind of hardware they ship is going to change, because they're not interested in stuff which falls apart after 2 to 3 years, because I'm just paying a flat monthly fee, and if it breaks, it's their problem, not my problem. And so you could see changes in how the hardware works. You could see emphasis on reliability and support that we haven't seen before. It's a different ballgame. And it's not even just for me as a technology. I work for a database company. That's not it. I'm just seeing second and third order effects here. But there's lots of cool things I can do and my friends and buddies can do. But from a business perspective, people need to think through the whole data ecosystem and how it gets monetized and where it gets monetized. And they should do that before they ship product. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, and I think another topic I'd like to cover when we think of, what is an operator selling that could create new revenue streams from them? Mobile private networks. This is a big one. So, David, what's going on with Vodafone Americas MPN business, and specifically, what kind of is attracting customers to a private network as opposed to a public network, or even if you look ahead a little bit, a slice of a public network?
Well, I think they're very MPNs. Let me just see if I'm I'm off mute. Good. Well, it provides a very secure and reliable, dedicated network. And I think, especially with MPNs, variety matters. I think one key advantage of technology is probably the fact that it can provide an underlying platform for businesses to develop new applications on, increase your efficiency, your safety, and address a lot of pain points that a lot of businesses had over the last couple of years when it came to deploying networks, especially manufacturing. It was sometimes a disaster on large scale sites, lots of metal, lots of things moving around. It was a really difficult and capex heavy investment to get networks up and running. So I think if with the right range of channels, so frequencies, a business can really use a mixture of low power, wide area solutions to gather occasional, but really crucial and data for underground cabling. So and it will really connect the workforce on the factory floor. And once you have really 5G and slicing all that available, you'll get real time access to all your applications. And then combining that with the other technologies like IoT, artificial intelligence, I think that's really what is driving customers to develop and deploy these mobile private networks.
Arpan, what are you seeing around mobile private networks? Are you noticing a preference to buy kind of a turnkey solution, or in markets where there's liberalized access to spectrum, do you see companies kind of working with a radio vendor, working with the system integrator, and taking a more piecemeal approach? What's going on from Deloitte's perspective?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there is definitely a lot of interest in essentially establishing the private networks, especially since the CBRS spectrum became available here in the US. So a lot of POC activity going on, a lot of campus networks being set up. And frankly, like all kinds of sectors or industry verticals are looking at essentially establishing private networks. So manufacturing, there are some in the energy space, there are some that are in a campus setting, there are some around even healthcare, which are essentially exploring what the art of the possible looks like with essentially private networks, and what are the sort of things that you can do using a private network. And David mentioned the greater security, the greater control that comes with having your own private network, and also an experimentation of what essentially once you get 5G and things like that, what sort of more granular controls, what sort of more granular things around latency and things like that that you can enable. So there is definitely a lot of activity in this space and a lot of interest in this space as well. Coming to your question around how are enterprises going about it, it's basically a combination. So there are enterprises who are more on the savvier side, who would want to have an active skin in the game, where they are saying, hey, I would want you to partner with this and this sort of vendors. Whereas there are some others who are like, hey, I'm not essentially somebody who has designed a wireless network or managed it or run it before. So why don't you come with your coalition of partners and essentially have it set up, of course, under our guidance, under our requirements. But why don't you come in? And there are some that essentially reach out to even a operator to say, hey, you know about this, you've done this forever. Let's come to our facility and essentially let's create an ecosystem around it and go after it. So it's a very broad spectrum.
Azita, I think a lot of what we talk about so far in this panel is, new service revenues. But I guess when you really deconstruct monetization, you can make the argument that it's also keeping money you would have otherwise spent. So when it comes to Rakuten Symphony, help us understand, one, what that investment can do for an operator's total cost of ownership, and then two, how does it relate to service velocity and time to market, monetizing something more quickly?
Yeah, great question. I'll give you examples of what we have done that's worked for us in Japan. We have been able to reduce our CapEx spending by 40%. And that has been primarily from this investment that operators generally make in the RAN, and that's about 70% of how much they invest in the network. And we've been able to reduce that drastically. And that, you could virtualize your core, but the amount of savings is not that great, because obviously you have a distributed RAN, you have more RAN elements in your network, and bringing that cost down really impacts your CapEx. So going from this monolithic RAN with lots of investment to this containerized and virtualized software running on top of IT services brought up has reduced our CapEx quite a bit, and also simplified the site. So if you think about leasing the site or owning the site, those prices have come down in terms of whole automation that we've brought in. Because one of the things people don't see as much, the operations of the network is a big headache, right? So being able to reduce that and automate that provides a lot of OpEx savings. And we have seen that both in terms of designing and building the network, and in terms of monitoring and managing the network. So for example, in the design and build, that's why we were able to do 96% 4 years ahead of time. It's because now we're doing 200 cell site provisioning a day now. We're at that level, and you could not do that with the old-fashioned ways of every cell site provision takes a couple of days to do. So those things, the automation adds a lot, like the provisioning of a new subscriber, it only takes 3 minutes versus 3 hours, or adding new features, it only takes a few days versus waiting 6 months for the new upgrade to show up. So all of those things bring down the CapEx and OpEx, and for us, that's been in the neighborhood of 35 to 40% TCO. And we think that, of course, every operator's mileage may differ, but those savings are real. Now, what do you do with those savings? You could invest it back into the network if you'd like, or in our case, we passed those savings to our subscribers. So we've been able to reduce the ARPU to less than half of what the going ARPU was when we went live. So that is a humongous amount of savings that you could decide to do what you want with it. One thing, though, I wanted to mention, and kind of following up on what Arpan said about private 5G networks, is that, if you think about Wi-Fi networks, right? Wi-Fi networks can be offered as a service to enterprises, and that way they don't have to worry about, where am I going to put these access points? If it goes to the next version, as David Rolfe was saying, I don't want to deal with it. So they have that choice of Wi-Fi as a service. And I think that private 5G network as a service could also be a very attractive proposition for enterprises as well. And then, of course, you add other things to it. Now, the bigger enterprises may want to do some of that management of the devices and so forth themselves, and then you can offer some of these managements to them. Or they want to be like totally hands off and let others take care of it. So, but I think that as a service model, just to provide that private 5G to enterprise is a big deal. And that's why this RAN as a service model that we have would work in that environment very well, we think.
Right. And David, Rolfe, I wanted to circle back to your comment that, capturing and holding data that you're not effectively using is almost a liability. But, when you're making a data strategy, how do you know what you don't know? How can you make some assumptions around what might be useful and what may not be useful?
You go to a school for astrology. But here's the thing. I have a long background in databases. Years and years ago, I started out as an Oracle consultant. And the traditional thing in the relational database world was, let's store everything forever in case one day we need it. You can't do that now for two reasons. One, it's illegal. It's illegal in Europe. If you don't have a good reason, you should not be storing it. It's becoming illegal in California. It's going to be illegal everywhere sooner or later. The second is the sheer quantity of data we now generate dwarfs absolutely everything we've ever done before. My first job, I'm showing my age here, I was a computer operator with 9-track tape, and we had enough tape to cross the Atlantic. And we had a building which had 500 megabytes of data in it, in a tennis court size room. Now, I can now buy servers with 500 megabytes or 500 gigabytes, right? So the sheer quantity of data we're producing is going to make it, you can't just keep it all. That's the first thing. And secondly, unless you put structure and cohesion on it, you can't safely use it. If you want automated non-human decision making, you better be sure that you've got control over it. So here at Volt, our argument is that we're moving from a world where we always store sometimes process, the classic world, to the always process and sometimes store world. So there is no easy answer to that. And that's my point. We probably need to start with a business problem and go backwards and figure out what you should be collecting. Now, I think getting a feed from something on a network and throwing it away until you have a reason not to is probably a lot safer and smarter and more defensible than sticking it in a data warehouse and then forgetting the key. because we see all these incidents about there's bizarre data sets that get unleashed on the public. And and because you're moving from shipping stuff in boxes and your obligation ends when you have the FedEx tracking number and you send it to the customer, and that's the end of your problem. And now you're going to have a permanent millisecond by millisecond relationship with these people. You will know more about them than they know about themselves. And if you leak their data, they will not be happy. And I don't mean they won't be buying your stuff in future. You'll be getting lawyers' letters. So I just think that it's a really tough question. And I think I'd much rather people ask it up front and have the really difficult conversation is what is our plan? And what's our explanation if we're asked when we're keeping stuff? Because traditionally, this industry has gone away of absolute murder with keeping data on people. And it's going to be where there's going to be an accountability. We're seeing it now with companies like Facebook. And so just because I know, every time a door opens in an office building doesn't mean I should store it. And certainly doesn't mean I should, use it indiscriminately. So I just think that, I'm the low-level technical guy, and I'm having the high concept, almost sociology argument here. But as the data person, I get afraid when people ask to keep stuff forever.
I think we've got time left for maybe some brief summary thoughts. So, I know this is a big, broad question, but in the context of 5G enabled enterprise digitization, what are the top 2 or 3 imperatives that operators need to stick to monetize their investments? David Joosten, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think ecosystem is massively important for us. Is that we activate an ecosystem and also an ecosystem of partnerships. I think the day and age where we would invest in it ourselves and put up the large amounts of capex and opex to develop everything ourselves are over. So for us, it's massively important to choose the right partnerships. I think you've seen that already. Well, for Vodafone at least, we've partnered with Amazon quite strongly, especially on MEG. We've partnered with Accenture. There's quite some significant partnerships that we've announced. So that is the first thing. I think also being very specific on the verticals that we do target ourselves is critical. And then last but not least is be very wise in the capex that we are investing in the spectrum that we are buying, because it has shown for us that it was a very capex intensive couple of years, which has been very critical for the industry of operators. So going forward, we have to be very mindful of that.
Right. We've got about 3 minutes left, but Arpan, final thoughts?
Coming back to how operators can be successful in this space. In addition to what David just said around alliances and ecosystems, I would just and we talked about technology and we talked about latency. So I'll talk about, I would say again, or reinforce the point around culture and workforce. This is a fundamentally different setting in which telcos or operators are trying to push more products and more services to. And what often gets lost in this is telcos globally are very good at optimizing operations. They know how to do this. They've done this for decades and decades. But with 5G, there is a real opportunity in essentially going after targeted verticals, creating specialized solutions, driving more of the revenue uplift that's always been talked about, has always been hard to come by. But this time, I feel the premise is real. So carriers globally need to invest to be able to grow. And that is a culture change. If historically you've been just focused on operations optimization, it's a harder bucket or harder mold to break out of. But that is going to be paramount, that culture change and training the workforce and making sure that the workforce is ready to be able to work in this cloud native era, being comfortable working not just with the big 2 or big 3 network vendors or BSS vendors, but with 5, 10, 15 smaller startups that have niche products and solutions that they're bringing to the market that comes with their own agility and things like that. So it's a fundamental shift in how carriers have operated.
Azita, any brief summary thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with?
Yeah, I think, you either go digital or you go home, right? You need to be based in the cloud. You need to have very agile architecture in order to be able to do this, and you need to have improvement in each part of this process. That best of breed is not a cliche anymore. Because your competitors are doing this, you need to be best in each of these areas, and you can't be best by yourself. So you need to bring an ecosystem of partners to help you with that. And by scaling and combining these things together, that would really force multiply the savings that you have, and then also the revenues that you will generate from that.
Excellent. David, Rolfe, last word. 5G monetization. What would you like to leave the audience with?
3 things. Start with your latency budget and go backwards when looking at what people are building. If you're a telco, you have a reputation for sensible, sane behavior compared to a lot of internet companies. And so when you get into I'm going to mind your data and be inside and be server-side everything, remember that, because people would trust telcos with personal data more than they probably trust a lot of internet companies, because the industry has a reputation for sober, sane behavior. So that needs to feed into your data strategy, which needs to think in terms of always process, sometimes store, and instead of just always keeping data. But remember that as a telco, part of your value is that you're predictable and safe. And so before you go off down really exciting adventures with other people's data, always remember that, because that's a key point, a key value you have.
Right. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to have this discussion with me and share your perspective with our audience. And we will be right back in 2 minutes with a session on fixed wireless access. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.